resilience. So that's the topic for today. One more thing that I would like to add before the start of the program or her presentation is that today's program is also supported by Menti. So if you have any questions that you would like to submit for Sister Marzia to answer at the end of her presentation, please do so. So I'd like to welcome Sister Marzia Hassan to start her presentation.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الصلاة والسلام على محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي ربي زدني علما. So assalamu alaikum everyone, and welcome to our Jaffrey Support Services monthly program, which is called Community Awareness Program, which is CAP. And we do these we try to do them regularly so that we can bring awareness on mental and emotional health issues to the wider community, and also at the same time hopefully gain some skills and some awareness of what we can do to help our own mental and emotional well-being. So the topic for today is practical tools for building resilience. And what we're going to be talking about is evidence-based practices to navigate challenges and setbacks. And the reason, of course, why this is so important in this day and age is, as we all know, the entire world is going through challenges right now. And all of us could do with some help and support and how we can navigate these challenges to the best of our ability. So the agenda for today is basically that we will first talk about what resilience is and why it matters. Why is this something that we need to talk about? We will talk a little bit about the science of resilience, what research says today, what we know in terms of research in psychology. And then, we'll spend some time on really practical things that all of us can do on a regular basis in order to make ourselves more resilient. And inshallah, we hope to have some time for question and answers as well. So what is resilience? It's a fairly new concept in psychology. And the way it's defined is that it is the power or ability of a material to return to its original form, position, after being bent, compressed, or stretched. In other words, elasticity, right? Or flexibility. So if we have a material which is resilient, for example, even if we pull it, we bend it, it'll come back to its former shape, right? It'll spring back. And obviously, in terms of emotional and psychological terms, it means it is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties, right? In other words, that we are not easily broken, we are tough. And resilience is also talked about in organizational terms. It's an ability of a system or an organization to respond to or recover readily from a crisis or a disruptive process. So, for example, a family would be a system. And resilience of a family means that if a family was to go through a significant crisis or something which disrupts its balances, if it was resilient, it would be able to come back from those challenges and regain its stability. Now, there is a problem with the definition of resilience, and that is that it suggests that we bounce back to where things were before the crisis or the challenge, right? That is how it is, talked about generally, that it is bouncing back. Like if we were to explain resilience, what that means to a 12-year-old or to a child, we would say, it's the ability, you fall down and you're able to get up again and you bounce back to where you were before you fell down. The issue, though, is that can we really bounce back from adversity, right? Reality is that we can't go back in time and we cannot go back to the way things were before the challenge. To put it very simply, what's done cannot be undone, and some of what life does to us can be pretty harsh. So, in other words, let's just take this current pandemic. Many people have suffered a lot of adversity during the pandemic, and things cannot really go back to the way they were before it, right? Sometimes, things happen in the world which changes the world forever. 9/11 was really, it's a very good example. And so is the pandemic. We can't really go back because the world has changed beyond recognition, right? So while we cannot go back into the way things were, we can learn how to bounce better into the future. This is it's an easy way to look at it. And so a preferred definition, which I prefer this definition just because it's also much more in line with the Islamic concept of growing through adversity. So resilience is that ineffable quality. Ineffable simply means that it's something that cannot easily be grasped. It's not material, right? That allows some people to be knocked down by life and come back stronger than ever. Rather than letting failure overcome them and drain their resolve, they find a way to rise from the ashes, right? This is a very, very hopeful and positive kind of view of adversity. And again, this is extremely in line. We, all of us know people who've gone through a lot of challenges, whether it could be health, economics, relationship. And through that challenge, when they maintain their faith, they do certain things, and they have the mindset that allows them to cope with those challenges. All of them, many of them will say that although they wouldn't have wished for the challenge, but they are so much better and stronger because of it, right? We all of us know people like that. And coming to the Quran, in Surah Ankabut, Allah says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, do men think that they will be left alone on saying we believe and not be tried? Certainly we tried those before them, so Allah will certainly know those who are true, and He will certainly know the liars, right? And the word that Allah uses here is fitna, right? And to explain fitna, how Mufassirin and scholars explain the word fitna, they say that it means to melt gold in order to separate its impure parts. And Imam Hassan alayhi salam, he defined it as that which proves man's reality, his divine origin, by what appears to be affliction, turmoil, and trouble. So in other words, the purpose of affliction and trial in this world is so that we can be purified, we can come out stronger. Gold, when it's not purified, a diamond, when it's not polished, is not worth anything, right? And when the diamond goes through a lot of pressure, it comes out with something that is beautiful, reflects the light, and is really valuable. So this hadith is again very relevant to us. It says, you will be tried like gold is tried in a furnace, and you will be purified like gold is purified under the pressure of fire. So, this is exactly what we are talking about. So resilient people, in other words, according to what we are talking about today, do not bounce back. They move forward. And they move forward by integrating what has happened to them, and they use it as fuel for growth. This is an extremely important point, right? And of course, we will talk about the practicality of this, right? How this comes to be. And again, this is a really beautiful saying. It says, wind extinguishes a candle and it energizes fire, right? And when we think about fire, if it's a very small fire, or if just a candle, there's a strong wind, obviously the flame will go out, right? But when the fire becomes big, actually whatever you throw in it, it energizes it, and it becomes bigger and bigger, and it consumes whatever you throw in the fire as fuel, right? So this is the concept in this book called Antifragile, which is really a very, very interesting concept that basically, for some people, whatever happens to them, they take that as the fuel for growth, and they become stronger, not in spite of the challenges, which is what resilience suggests, but actually because of the challenges. And just to give you some idea, the idea of resilience, it's talked about in many, many different ways, right? Bouncing back, fortitude, mental toughness, psychological strength, grit, inshallah, which we will be talking about tomorrow with parents. But the two concepts that that I'd like to focus on, one is this concept of anti-fragility. In other words, that when something is fragile, something happens to it, it breaks, right? And when something is resilient, you can put it back together. But anti-fragile means that the more you break something, it actually becomes stronger, right? And this is the concept of post-traumatic growth, which is a concept in psychology today, which we will discuss in a little bit as well. So these are the three concepts, right? One is fragile, which means you break down at the first sign of challenges, and the other is resilient, which means that you are actually you recover. And anti-fragile, which suggests post-traumatic growth, is that you actually become stronger as a result of those challenges. So now let's talk a little bit about why resilience matters. And just to put it in context, I'm going to be using the words resilience, anti-fragile, and post-traumatic growth all interchangeably, right? But as long as we know what we're talking about and that there is a slight difference in the literature, we can all be on the same page. So, why resilience matters is that, while we are on this plane of existence, while we are in this world, we know that we will have small challenges and major hardships. They are a part of life. We will never be in a state, this life, we are told again and again in spiritual literature, is not meant for a place of rest, right? And sometimes we think that when we are having challenges, there's something quote unquote wrong, and that once the challenge is over, that's going to be the normal. But we really have to reframe that and understand that this world is always going to be full of challenges. If it is not physical, it's economic. If it's not economic, it's relationship. And the pace of change in the world we know is escalating. And so is the need, along with it, to be flexible and adjust to the new realities instead of fighting them. So, again, as the holidays are coming up, for example, many of us, including me, are going to be spending a very, very different kind of holiday than we are used to, right? So many of us would be expecting children to come home, grown-up children, or visiting families, or at least getting together with neighbors, friends, whoever's around us. And reality is that this holiday is going to look very different for all of us, and as it should. And we could spend a lot of time moaning about the fact that it is different and what we could do instead. And we wish that it would be quote unquote normal, right? So, resilience is a very, very important concept for youth and children as well. We know that greater resilience leads to improved learning and academic achievement. It is related to lower absences from work or school due to sickness, and it contributes to reduce risk-taking behaviors, including drinking, smoking, and use of drugs. Why this is important to know is because many youth, we sometimes don't understand why they use substances or why they harm themselves, for example. And if we consider that generally all of these behaviors are coping mechanisms, they're coping mechanisms because the youth are having a hard time coming to terms with what is happening, right? Whether it's in the world, whether it's in their family, whether it is in their personal relationships, whatever, right? So when they have increased resilience, when they are able to take challenges in their strides, they don't need those coping behaviors quite so much, and therefore it contributes to a reduced behaviors such as use of substances, for example. And those with greater resilience, we know, tend to be more involved in community and or family activities. And it is also related to a lower rate of mortality and increased physical health. And all of this makes sense, right? Because if we are not resilient, if we are, for example, panicking at the first sight of trouble, if we are having trouble coping with our own lives, clearly we will not have time to be involved in the community, and many youth in particular tend to withdraw, right? They withdraw from family life, from community life. We know that resilience actually is a big predictor um, overall health as well, and of course mental and physical. And with greater resilience, people have less depressive symptoms, greater resistance to stress, and also better coping with stress. We will talk a little bit about stress and how we can, when we're talking about the practical aspects as well. Resilience is also correlated with successful aging, and of course there's many these are just summaries of research studies, but it's important to know that it's also better management of PTSD symptoms, right? And we will also talk about that in a little bit. Resilience is also important for our work and careers. So, for example, resilience means that we are okay with failing, that we are okay with setbacks, we are okay with trying something, with taking a risk in academia, for example, as youth, or in our careers, right? And without the resilience, without the confidence in our ability that, even if we don't succeed the first time, we can still try again. We can understand how, if we don't have that kind of mindset, we'll always play small. We won't be trying things that we may succeed at because of the fear of failure. And the fear of failure actually is a big sign that we need to work on our resilience. And we know if we keep, we will never reach our full potential if we are always in our comfort zone. In fact, one of the things that resilient people do is that they are continuously outside their comfort zone. They don't live in their comfort zone. So let's talk a little bit more about what the science of resilience actually means. So we know that basically, we have challenges outside, and we can respond in a variety of ways, right? And psychology in recent times, they've talked a lot about the trauma response to extreme adversity. So trauma simply means that something happens which is greater than my ability to cope with that at that point, right? And when that happens, it's always sudden, and I go through a variety of systems and responses which are called trauma responses. And we've also heard of the term of PTSD, which means post traumatic stress disorder. And what that does is it actually impacts all aspects of our life: our physical health, our mental health, our emotional health, our relationships, our spiritual health. And so science has been focusing a lot on trauma, and rightfully so. However, trauma is one side of the coin, right? Now, just to again reiterate, and please take this in context: trauma and the ability to respond to traumatic experiences in terms of providing support is extremely important, because it gives us access to psychological therapies for those who need them, and it allows us to provide support for people who are struggling. So please, it's not to say that it is not a valid diagnosis, or that it is not that we shouldn't put resources in it, right? However, the increased focus only on the trauma response has had some outcomes for for a lot of people. And this is a really great book by Stephen Joseph called What Doesn't Kill Us. And what he talks about is something which is not talked about all that much in psychology generally, which is the idea of post-traumatic growth. And he says that, focusing too much on trauma, what happens is that it's taking the responsibility away from the people. It's creating almost a culture of expectation that if something has happened, that you will have a trauma response. And it's funny, because when I'm working with youth in particular, or even my own relatives or the youth in my life, uh, they often joke about, something will happen and they said, oh, I was traumatized, right? Because there's an expectation that if something has happened, that you should feel, you should, have flashbacks, that it should impact you psychologically, right? And the main thing is that that just focusing on the PTSD and on trauma, it ignores the personal growth that often arises following trauma. So not everyone has a trauma response. Some people, when they go through significant adversity in their life, everyone goes through, it is normal to have a period of grief, it is normal to have a period of adjustment, all of that is normal, right? However, people who focus on meaning, purpose in life, who have a strong spiritual connection, in the sense that they recognize that everything that happens in their life has meaning, right? And their purpose in life is to grow. For people, who have those kinds of things, they often, the period of grief follows, is followed by a period of growth. And viewed in this light, post-traumatic stress, the stress that happens when we encounter a major stressor or a challenge in life, can be understood as a search of meaning in which the drive to revisit, remember, and think about the trauma is a normal urge to make sense of a shocking experience, to grasp new realities and incorporate them into their own life story. Again, I would like to really caution ourselves. Please, this is for us to understand the full picture. We should not, please use this information to either minimize somebody's suffering, to tell somebody that they're overreacting, or to suggest that they are not coping in the best way. This is not what is meant, right? It is for us to understand our own personal responses and work at them. So, in other words, post traumatic stress can be the engine of transformation. And this is what the process which is called post traumatic growth. So, now let's come back to resilience. Now, resilience, if you look at, what is it that causes post traumatic growth, how can we increase our chances to have a growth response rather than a trauma response after a major stressor? It's basically a balance of risk factors and protective factors, right? So if I have a risk factor, so let's go to the next slide and then I'll explain it some more. So we have challenges in life, right? Challenge could be, let's just take a really simple example, that I'm washing dishes. Okay, that's the challenge. And at the same time, I have some personal vulnerabilities. What would be the vulnerability is that maybe I have a cut on my finger. So when I put my hand in that water, if my husband's washing the dishes, if he doesn't have the cut on his finger, he will not experience any problems, right? But because of my vulnerability, which is the cut on my finger, I will experience a challenge when I'm washing the dishes. And then, to add the third part of the equation is the resources that I have. So I could have external resources, right? In this case, an external resource might be that I put some ointment on it, I wear a rubber glove to protect my finger, and an internal resource might be that I have a high tolerance for pain, for example, right? So, it's the interplay of all of these things that cause us to either go down the path of breaking down or the path of growing through challenges. Now, when we look at this diagram, for example, what do we have the most control over? Challenges are always outside of ourselves. It is what happens in the world, it happens in our relationship, in our jobs, in our families, and we have very little control over that. Vulnerabilities, we also have little control over. Why? Because vulnerabilities could be something that happened to us as a child. What happened to us when we were 3 or 4, which causes us to have certain core vulnerabilities or some enduring sensibilities, for example, right? Resources are something that we can actually change, that we have the power and the ability and the agency to work on. So we have external resources. External resources means, what help I can get, my relationships, which is extremely, one of the biggest sources of resilience for human beings is their relationships. So, for all of us, we need to aim to have relationships that are both supportive and supporting. In other words, supporting other people and also receiving support from others. Okay, so those are all the external. Our internal resources are things the way I think, the way I, what I say, what I do. All of those things are what build my internal resource system. So, the three themes at the core of post traumatic growth are the recognition that acceptance that things change and that life can be challenging. It's literally having that expectation rather than the expectation that things can only be normal or okay if everything is going smoothly. Then the second part of it is psychological mindfulness. In other words, self-awareness of my own thoughts, feelings, and actions. How am I making? So, for example, if I experience a challenge, I can either make it worse or I can make it better. And how am I contributing to that? Again, this is very different from victim blaming. It doesn't mean, and it's not about others, right? It's about ourselves. So, for example, even if I am in let's take a really traumatic situation. If I am in a situation where I've lost my job, for example, there are still things like if I acknowledge personal agency, there are things that will make it better if I look for more jobs, for example, and things that will make it worse. For example, if I don't want to get out of bed or if I'm feeling so depressed that I can't cope. Okay. So, learning to cope with manageable threats and external challenges by building internal resources is critical for the development of resilience. And it's basically this is what creates our emotional, spiritual, and mental well being, right? So, in other words, we just focus on what we can do internally to make ourselves stronger. So we know that resilience can be developed at any age. Obviously, earlier is easier in the sense that, if from a very young age children are taught to be resilient, it's easier for them. However, we cannot give up because we know now through psychology, through neuroscience that there is, that our brains are flexible, that we can learn while we are alive. So, like I said, supportive relationships and opportunities for skill building are the two main things that we can do in order to build resilience. And we build resilience by working on small challenges so that we are able to deal with the bigger ones. So, in other words, we don't need to wait till something major goes wrong. We can start making ourselves mentally and emotionally, spiritually, physically strong before we get into any trouble. So, for example, it could be simply, in the morning, in the days that we were leaving the house, for example, or our children were actually going to school. Everyone's getting ready for school, and one of the children drops milk, right? And there's milk all over the place, and we all have to leave for work. That's a really small thing. But in resilience, that would mean that rather than, quote unquote, freaking out or losing it or getting upset, we actually look at the situation and we're able to pause and not make it worse, because the reality is that the milk has spilt. We cannot take that back, right? And the difference is only how we deal with that situation. So now let's talk a little bit about the actual tools to build resilience. The first thing, and we've been alluding to this already, is to check our perceptions and manage our expectations. So, perception is basically how we see and understand what occurs around us and what we decide those events will mean, right? Perception is extremely important because it can either be a source of strength or it can be a source of great weakness for us. So, what this means is that we learn to manage our expectations. A lot of us, we live our entire lives waiting for a time in our life quote unquote, where we will be at peace, right? Where there will be no challenges, where we will, our kids will be grown up, they will have settled down, our careers, lives will be, at a place where we can rest, right? Reality is that life doesn't work that way, because when we reach that stage, many of us find that that's when health challenges start, for example, right? So we need to manage our expectations that there may not be a time in our life where we will be free from change or struggle or worry. And if we accept this, that this is a part of life, this is one of the greatest things we can do for our own resilience. So we need to understand that our objective is not to come to rest, but to use what hits you to change your trajectory in a positive direction. In other words, this goes back to the same thing that, if you look at the image of a fire, whatever you put in the fire, it uses it as fuel for growth. And this is from Martin Seligman, who is, we could call him the grandfather of positive psychology, and his brilliant book, Flourish. So he says that it is not the adversity, but your beliefs about the adversity that causes the feelings. So, for example, let's take the spilt milk. The milk has spilled in the morning, and there are two things, and sometimes I will do this. It's a little experiment that you actually you probably don't have the time to do it when the milk has spilled, but if you think about it later, and on a scale from 0 to 10, you simply think about how upset you are. And if you tell yourself that this always happens, now I'm going to be late again for work, and my child is so clumsy, no matter how many times I tell them that they are that they need to be careful, that they need to hold the glass properly, they just never listen. None of my children listen. And you can see, we can go on and on, right? Now just check yourself on a scale from 0 to 10, how upset are you? It's the same situation. And then the same situation, you tell yourself, they're only a child, and it's only milk, and it can be cleaned up, and no harm done. Even if I'm late to work, what's the worst that can happen, right? And then you check yourself from 0 to 10, how upset are you? And you will find that when you can catch yourself in those moments, and you can tell yourself just positive things, in the moment, you can change your own, and it's a practice. All of these things we're talking about is a practice, which means that they don't happen automatically. Just because we read about them, just because we hear about them, it's not going to happen automatically, right? We need to keep doing it again and again and again in order to actually change the way we think and the way we behave, right? So this happened and this is bad, for example, are two different things. So, again, going back to the example of the milk dropped, and this is a catastrophe, for example. Now, the first part, the milk dropped or this happened, is objective. Everybody would agree, whoever was there would agree that yes, the milk did drop, right? The second, however, that this is a catastrophe and this is going to happen, and my child is so clumsy, all of that is very subjective. It is how I am interpreting that event, right? And when I practice changing the way I look at things, then the things that I'm looking at change. So let's do a little practice, right? When we look at something, do we consider it to be a challenge, or we do consider it to be a threat? And how we look at the challenge or the obstacle will determine how we respond, right? So this is what we call the neuropsychology of challenge, right? In other words, that when something happens and we consider it a challenge, right, they actually, different hormones are released into our bloodstream, and our entire physiology responds in a way that is more beneficial. Okay, this is of course a long subject, but I'm giving you a very, very shortened version of it. However, if we respond to the same thing as a threat means that someone is attacking me, this is all about me, it's personal, why does this always happen to me? When I start thinking like this, different chemicals are let into my bloodstream, which will cause me to be more on high alert, which will raise my threat vigilance, and I will be responding as if my child is, it sounds very extreme. So let's take a argument with a spouse, right? Because even Sheikh Jafar mentioned that in his speech. So if my spouse is complaining to me about something, okay, something that I've done, and if I consider that as a challenge of how we can improve or how we can do better, I am going to, automatically it will be a bonding experience between the two of us, right? However, if I consider what he's saying as the threat, it is a threat to me and he is criticizing me, it's actually the fight or flight response will be activated in my body, and I start to look at him as the enemy, right? And that's why when we are in arguments with our loved ones, it's by the way, when two people are triggered, is the worst time ever to do any problem solving, because at that point your rational brain is actually asleep, it is offline, it is not working right? So when people are triggered or they're angry or they're upset, that's the worst time to do problem solving, whether it's with your children or with your spouse, right? Now, on the other hand, it's also when we tell ourselves that if I'm anxious, that means it's something bad that I need to calm myself, right? Often, so for example, if somebody is going for a test, if our child is going for a test, we will tell them just calm down. If, for example, we're about to speak, we might want to calm ourselves down. However, very interestingly, what science has found is that that's not the best response. Because when you are calm, you are not at your best, because your body, your mind is not geared to do your best work. You actually need to be a little bit anxious, you need to be a little bit excited in order for you to perform at your best, okay? So, just when we are talking to kids, for example, or we are, if they are nervous about something, instead of telling them that to calm down, it's much more effective to help them reframe anxiety, which is also a high level emotion, right? As opposed to calm. Instead of anxiety, help them see, and this we can do for ourselves as well, that anxiety and excitement actually feel the same in the body. So if you talk somebody through it, if you ask them, you are anxious, what's happening? And they'll say, oh, I have knots in my stomach and my heart is beating faster and I'm feeling a bit sweaty in my palms. You say, okay, and that sounds like excitement to me. It's the same, like just before you're about to go on a roller coaster, for example, you get the same feeling. You get the feeling of knots in your stomach, your heart beating faster, your palms a little bit sweaty. So in order to reframe anxiety, let's not go to calm, because when you have something to perform, or you have to run a race or speak in public or sit an exam or do a work project, any of these, it's much more effective to actually reframe the anxiety to excitement rather than to calm. So that's our second practice of the day. And this is a very easy one, and very, all of us can learn it quite quickly, which is, again, it's about reframing obstacles, and it's the expectation that obstacles actually make me stronger. So many of us have heard the mantra Om, right? Which mindfulness, some communities use it. And this is very similar. It's OMS, right? Obstacles make me stronger, OMMS. And again, it's the idea of repeating it all the time to actually, it's very empowering self-talk. So it's a really fun thing to do with families as well, to remind ourselves that actually obstacles make me stronger. The second group of practices is about pressing the pause button and creating space between what happens and how we respond. In other words, so something happens, I call it the mini freak out, right? So something happens, say the milk spills, and you could have, if you just let yourself go and you're highly stressed and lots of things are going on around you, the likelihood is that you would have a mini quote unquote freak out, right? On the other hand, if we practice pressing pause, you just literally and what research shows is that it takes between 8 to 15 seconds of pause. It doesn't have to be a long time. You just pause, you literally take just one breath, you connect with what's happening, and you ask yourself, WIN, what's important now? So instead of pressing the pause button, instead of pressing the panic button, you press the pause button. Again, this is something that we can teach children from a very young age. So for little children, you can just tell them that they have a pause button on their forehead or on their wrist. And anytime something happens, if they're fighting with a sibling or somebody's taken a toy and they're having a tantrum, you simply remind them, press your pause button, and they will, children, the amazing thing is that they take on very quickly, and if we do it ourselves, of course they will learn that much quicker, right? So when after they press their pause button, they can ask themselves, what could I do that God would be happy with me? What could I do that mom would be happy with me? It's basically a chance to just give yourself the time and to reflect on what value you want to work from rather than just reacting in the moment of anger. So, again, the idea is that we reflect on, rehearse, and practice responding rather than reacting in the moment. All of these things that we're talking about, they're much, much easier if they are done for little things. So if we, for example, are, and I'm a strong proponent of doing all of these things together as a family. So when we are, so it's not about, that somebody being better than the others. If we're all, practicing the same thing, we're all on the same team. Again, remember, supportive relationships are one of the most important things for resilience. And then what happens is if we're all working on the same things, we keep each other accountable. So children will always call you out on, Mama, remember to press your pause button. And of course, we can do the same for them, right? So we can help each other build resilience in that way. Practice 5 is self-reflection after setbacks. So again, this is a very, very valuable practice to do if we've had a setback at work, at school, if children have had a setback, ask themselves, what did I do well? It's a very important thing to start with what did I do well, because the brain needs information on what it should do, not only on what it shouldn't do. So when we do something well, if we actually pause for a few moments and let that sink in, it again changes the way our brains react. So what did I do well? What did I learn? What did I learn from this experience? So for example, if I've done badly on an exam, I learned that, staying up till midnight watching Netflix the night before my exam was not such a good idea, right? So that's what I learned. What needs work? So needs work, this is hashtag needs work, right? It's again a very, very non-judgmental and very effective way to keep getting back on track. So reality is that even knowing all of these things, it's not going to change automatically, right? We need to practice it again and again and again. And when we fall off and we do something that we're not proud of, so for example we react in the moment, if we remind ourselves, what did I do well? So the first time my child argued with me, I didn't say anything. The second time I didn't argue. What did I learn? I learned that repeated things of the same thing, by them saying the same thing, and by them doing it in stereo, for example, two or three or four children at the same time, I learned that that really is hard for me to take. What needs work? More pausing. That's what needs work. What needs work is that I know if I haven't done self-care, if I haven't looked after myself, it's easier for me to react, right? The more we reflect and rehearse our responses, the easier it is to do them, in the moment. So, of course, focus and act on things that you can control. So, challenge experienced, again, what do we tell ourselves? Option for A is why me? Oh my God, or any variety of those things, which is again the victim mentality, right? And option B is what needs to be done. What's important now? WIN. Again, and such an important, I was talking to somebody recently and they were, organizing something major in COVID. They had to be really flexible and keep changing things around. And they said that one of the things that helped them most was this simple thing, that every time a new challenge would come, they would ask themselves, what's important now? What needs to be done? What do we need to focus on? So again, that brings us back right into the moment, and it's called developing a relentless solution focus, right? Keep coming back to, okay, what needs to be done? What do I need to do? What's going to make this better? And practice 7, which is the last practice we're going to be talking about, but it's extremely important, which is ritualized daily self-care. We need to, if you think about a strong building, you can't build a strong building without really deep and strong foundations. So if we want to do, if we want to live up to our full potential that God has given us, do meaningful work, show up for our families, serve humanity, all of that takes energy and effort. And if we don't take care of our own selves, we cannot give to anybody else, right? We can't pour water from an empty jug. So, physical, mental, emotional, spiritual. What habits of self care help you perform at your best? What's your keystone habit? All of us have things that we know. When I'm doing this, my whole life works better, right? So, for example, if you know that the day you exercise, the day you exercise in the morning, the day you walk for 30 minutes, 35 minutes, or you go outside, walk in the garden, whatever it is, you know that the day you do that, your entire day works better. The day you wake up for namaz-e-shab, you know that you are much more in charge of yourself. You are able to manage everything else. You know that when you have had a good night's sleep, when you've turned off the lights earlier rather than staying up, beyond the time that you should, you know that you're much more able to manage challenges, right? All of us have those things that we know that if we were to do them, our lives would work better. And one of the strongest things about resilience is that it's simply taking those habits and ritualizing them so that we do them more often. So, just to recap, we need to reframe obstacles as growth opportunities. So, I didn't mention it here, but one of the things, when we have triggers, for example, right? It's a good thing to remind ourselves that every trigger is another growth opportunity, AGO, right? Uh, Pressing the pause button. So even if there's no challenge, for example, right? Pressing the pause button means having a period of silence, sitting on your musalla longer than you need to, or longer than, even after you finished everything. Reducing input. One of the things that stresses us more than anything else, and there's a lot of studies being done about this, the amount of input that modern humans are getting in a week is more than our ancestors would have gotten in their entire life. And it's not an exaggeration, right? So, and clearly, our physiology is not designed to cope with continuous input, right? So, pressing the pause button also means shutting off digital media, shutting off phones, shutting off screens, having a period of silence for yourself every single day. The third is what's important now. Again, focusing on the action that we do have control over rather than going into panic mode of things that we can't control. Reflecting, fourth is reflecting on personal setbacks and rehearsing responses even after the fact. In Islam, we are highly recommended to do muhasabah on a daily basis. In other words, to reflect what have we done well and what needs work, right? And the fifth is to practice regular self-care, to look after ourselves so that we can show up for others, so that we can do meaningful work, so that we can live our full potential. And that's the end of the presentation. Of course, we will, inshallah, we do have some time for questions. But here is just the contact information both for Jaffrey Support Services and also to remind anyone who wants them. The slides are already online, and here is the link for the slides. So one of the things, and perhaps people could put this in the chat or as comments, one of the key ways to learn and to change is to, when you hear something, and we as a community hear a lot all the time, is to reflect on what is our key takeaway and put something that you've learned into action as soon as possible, because that's what cements the learning. Because when we learn something, by tomorrow even I won't remember what I've spoken, right? So but if I actually take one thing and I start taking action on it, then actually that will give me results, inshallah. So ready for questions?
Thank you so much, Sister Marzia, for such an insightful presentation today. This has given all of us so much information, and it's so good to know how one can bounce back. The spilt milk is definitely an example, extremely relatable to me and with my children in our house. And I think I'm definitely going to use the WIN with our children at home as well, because it kind of will instantly snap them out of a situation and make them think what is important now. So that all these tips were amazing. We do have a few questions that have come up. The first